He feels that he has taken his mother for granted. He feels himself guilty that he has not kept his mother happy in his life. Borges says that when he could see everything, so all the things around him was very close to him. But when he has become blind at the age of 55, he feels that everything, whatever was close to him, have gone away from him. What is poetry? So he says it is so very essential that it cannot be defined without oversimplifying it. Hello everyone, I am Babita Tamaya, lecturer, Department of English, Vidhyaashram Pre-University College, the Temple of Excellence, Mysuru. In my previous revision class, I had revised the poem To the Food from its Child. In today's session, I'll be revising the chapter I Believe That Books Will Never Disappear. What is the agenda? In this chapter, I'll be discussing the synopsis, weightage of the proofs, question and answers. This chapter is an interview. Alifona is an interviewer who is interviewing Louis Borges. So what is his first question to Borges? I believe that books will never disappear, presents except from a face-to-face interview between George Louis Borges and Robert Alifano. Borges was an Argentine short story writer, essayist, poet, and translator who became partially blind at the age of 55. He shares his views about a few other topics like poetry, metaphors, and literature. So in this chapter, we'll be discussing about the poetry, about the metaphors, about the literature, about the theme of books in his interview. The interview begins with his first question. So who is questioning? Alifano is questioning Borges. So what was his question? First question. What was his first literary reading? In reply, Borges says that his first literary reading was Grimm's Fairy Tale, which was an English version. And he also says that he got more educated than going to school, that he got educated in the library, that is in his father's library. He was well educated. And his next question was about his mother. Can you just tell me about your mother? So Borges tells him that his mother was an extraordinary person who showed him a great deal of kindness in his life. So here, Borges' mother, Donna Lenora, she was an extraordinary person and she was very kind to her. She was showing kindness towards Borges. And he was not happy. He feels that he has taken his mother for granted. He feels himself guilty that he has not kept his mother happy in his life. Like all the children take their mother as granted. For example, how we take the sun, moon and the stars for granted, in the same way even Borges has taken his mother for granted. He never kept her happy. He feels himself guilty for not having been a happy man in order to have given his mother the happiness she deserved. He did not give any kind of happiness what she deserved. Then Borges adds that his mother was an intelligent and gracious woman who had no enemies. So here, when does Borges realize about his mother? When his mother is no more, he realizes how important she was in his life. Along with that, he adds one more sentence saying that my mother was a gracious and intelligent woman who had no enemies. And his next question from Alifano to Borges was, Alifano asked Borges apologetically what blindness meant to him. So his next question was about blindness. So what does Borges say? Borges says blindness, it is the way of life. It's a way of life, not entirely unhappy. Why does he say so? Because there are many people who are born blind and they just think that their life is done and dusted. It's over. They can't do anything in their life. But Borges says that it is a way of life. I'm not entirely unhappy. You cannot say that I'm unhappy in my life. He adds that as a writer, he generally believes that all persons must think that whatever happens to him or to her is the resource. Whatever has happened in his life, being born blind, it doesn't mean that you cannot do anything, you cannot achieve anything in your life. You cannot say that at all. So whatever has the God has given you, for example, a clay, so we have to make a model out of that clay. So he says, whatever happens, it is a way of life. We have to accept that and move forward. And it is given as a clay and we have to shape our future. He is of the opinion that all that happiness to us, including humiliations, misfortunes, and our embarrassments, are given to us as a raw material, as a clay that we may shape our art. As I told, so all the things is given to you as a raw material, but it is in your hand to shape your future. He quotes from Goethe, all that is near becomes far, and again is referring to the losses of his eyes. So what does that all that is near becomes far means here? Borges says that when he could see everything, so all the things around him was very close to him. But when he has become blind at the age of 55, he feels that everything, whatever was close to him, have gone away from him. That is far away from him. In the line quoted here, Goethe is referring to the evening twilight when the things closest to us seems to move away from our eyes. Borges is quoting this line to tell Alifano that this visible world has moved away from his eyes forever. So whatever the things he could see, when he had a good eyesight, so whatever the things he could see, now everything have moved away from his visible sight. So he is completely under darkness. Therefore, he tells Alifano that he still continued to pretend that he is not blind by buying books and filling his house. What does Borges is doing here? He wants to pretend in front of all the people saying that he is not blind. How does he pretend? He pretend by buying books and filling his house with books, saying that he is not a blind man. Alifano, hearing him mention books, asked Borges to speak about the theme of books. So when he says about the books, now he is questioning about the theme of books. At that time, Borges just remembers a dream which he had dreamt the previous day, and it was the burning of the great library of Alexandria, which was burnt into ashes. And he himself questions, saying that whatever the dream I had dreamt, does it have any meaning? Does it have any sense? He questions himself. As I told, he had dreamt about the Alexandria burning, the countless volumes attacked by flames. So all the complete library was burned into ashes and countless of volumes, that is the books, was burned into flames. He continues, whether you have ever thought of writing a book on the history of the book. Alifano is questioning Borges. Have you thought of writing any kind of books? That is the history of books. Borges says, at the age of 85, it is not possible for me to write a book, but agrees with him and tells him that book goes beyond its author's intention, which may not be right. Borges says that it is a good thinking. I'll just think about the writing of books, and Borges says that I just think about writing of the books. Borges concludes saying that books always retain something scared, something mortal, something magical, which brings happiness to us. Poetry is something so intimate and so essential that it cannot be defined without being oversimplified. So, Borges' next question is about poetry. What is poetry? So, he says it is so very essential that it cannot be defined without oversimplifying it. If one attempts to define poetry, it would be like attempting to define the color yellow, love, and the far of the leaves in autumn. So it is not so very easy to define poetry. It is very difficult. So he says poetry is like attempting to describe the color yellow or love or far of the leaves in autumn. Then he states that poetry is not the poem, but it is an aesthetic act. So what is poem? It is an aesthetic act, the poetic act that takes place when the poet writes it, when the reader reads it, and it always happens in a different manner. So if the poet has written a poem and the person and the reader, one who reads it, if he is not able to understand the poetry, then the poet becomes a failure. He cannot be a successful poet. Finally, Alifano asked Borges to comment on the statement of modern developments in communication will replace books with something more dynamic that will require less time than reading. Borges tells him that books will never disappear. So here, poetry, as Borges told, it is an aesthetic act. And the one who writes the poetry, he always should try to use the prescribed words. Prescribed in the sense, the exact words. And you can see in the poetry, you can also see the personification, similes, metaphors, alliteration, that is the figure of speeches in the poem. You cannot find that in the literature. So he also speaks about the metaphors. In this chapter, he has just mentioned about 4 or 5 metaphors. At last, he finally asked about the books. Will the books disappear? So what will be the Borges' answer? Borges says that book will never disappear. And he also gives an example like the telephone is the extension of a voice, the telescope and the microscope are the extension of a sight, and the sword and the plow are extension of our arms. But books are the only one is an extension of our imagination and memory. So he just gives an example saying that books will never disappear. Alifano asked Borges his reaction to his own statement, literature is a dream, and says that it is a controlled dream. Then he declares books are the great memory of centuries and their function is irreplaceable. He also finds one of the sentences from the book written by Emily Dickinson. So whenever she addressed the people that address the gathering, she just addressed saying that gentlemen and ladies. So instead of using the word the gentlemen and the ladies, would it be very well or would it be nice to hear the men and the women? No, it doesn't sound so very good. So he says this is the prescribed words which Emily Dickinson has used in one of her books. So instead of using, so he says to use the prescribed words. And at last he says that if books disappear, history would disappear and surely man would disappear. So according to Borges, books is the only astounding invention of man and it is an extension of humans' imagination and memory. At last he says books will never disappear. If books are going to disappear, surely history and man would disappear. So now let's see the weightage of this chapter. So you have 1 mark questions as well as 4 marks questions from this chapter. Now let's see the 1 mark questions of this chapter. What was first literary reading of Borges? As I told, it's the Grimm's Fairy Tale. Where was Borges educated? He was educated from his father's library. Who was Borges' mother? It is Donna Lenora. What does Borges fill his house with? Because he is blind. To pretend that he is not blind, what does he do? He just fills his house with books. How old was Borges at the time of giving his interview? He was at the age of 83 years. Which library does Borges visualize in his dreams? Library of Alexandria. Which is the most astounding invention of man according to Borges? It is books. When according to Borges would history and man disappear? When books disappear, history and man would surely disappear. Mention any one thing that Borges continued to do even after becoming blind. So what does he do? He continued to bring books or fill his house with books or speak about the theme of books. Out of these three answers, you can write any one. The square dust was gentlemen and ladies. This is the line from a poem by Emily Dickinson. What did Borges dream in a very strange dream? So, he dreamt about the burning of the great Alexandria, that is the library. When, according to Borges, does the poetic act happen? When the poet writes it and the reader reads it, the poetic act happens. What, according to Borges, is an extension of our voice? It is telephone. The book is an extension of imagination and memory. The microscope is an extension of our sight. What, according to Borges, would happen if books disappear? So, according to him, if books disappear, surely history and man would disappear. Now, let's see the 4 marks question. How does Borges describe his mother and his feelings for her in his interview? Borges' mother, Donna Lenora, was an extraordinary person. She was very kind to him. The secret of Borges was that he felt somewhat guilty for not having been a happy man in order to give her a deserved happiness. As I told, he never kept his mother happy in her life. Perhaps he should have been more understanding of her. But it is true that all children, when their mothers die, they feel that they have taken her for granted, that they do with moon, sun and the seasons. So why does Borges says that we all take granted like sun, moon and the seasons? Because we know when the sun sets, we know that next day morning the sun rises. It happens regularly. There is no change, and even in the seasons there is no change. When the sun sets, you can see the moon at night. So we have taken it granted. We don't even think that there will be a change because it is fixed. In the same way, most of the children, they take their mother as granted. But when she is no more, you realize how important she was in your life. Then he feels that they have abused her. Before her death, it doesn't dawn on us. Borges' mother was an intelligent and gracious woman who had no enemies. This is what he says about his mother in his interview. The next question. How does Borges explain about the blindness? Borges reconciles with his blindness, telling that it is a way of life, that it is not entirely unhappy. He believes that generally all persons must think that whatever happens to him or her is a resource. According to Borges, all things have been given for a purpose, and an artist must feel more intensely. All that happens, including humiliation, misfortunes and embarrassments, shape our art. All is given to us as a raw material, as a clay, so that we have to shape our art. This is what he says about blindness. How does Borges define poetry? Borges says that poetry is something intimate and essential, and it can be defined by oversimplifying it. It would be like defining the color yellow, love, and fall of leaves in autumn. Poetry is the aesthetic act. Poem is only a series of symbols. Poetry is the poetic act that takes place when the poet writes it and when the reader reads it. It is a magical, mysterious, and unexplainable, comprehensible event. The poet has failed in his poetry if one does not feel the poetic event upon reading it. In the art of poetry, finding the precise words is important. For example, Emily Dickinson wrote, "This quiet dust was gentlemen and ladies." If she had written men and women, it would have failed as a poetry. Why does Borges says that books will never disappear? Borges believes that books will never disappear. The book is the most astounding invention of man. All others are the extension of our bodies. For example, the telephone is the extension of a voice. The telescope and microscope are the extension of a sight. Sword and plow are the extension of our arms. Only book is an extension of our imagination and memory. Literature is a controlled dream. Books are of the great memory of all centuries and their function is irreplaceable. If books disappear, surely history and man would disappear. This is what he says about the theme of books or about the books. In my next revision class, I'll be revising the poem Heaven If You Are Not on Earth. Have a good day. Thank you.